Greetings and welcome to the first episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and this is my co-host, Caleb. Caleb, how you doing?
Doing really good.
We're excited to be here because we're going to start talking about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that shaped our adult lives. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of somebody who grew up during that era. Caleb, this isn't a guest today, but it is our first podcast. So, what are we going to talk about in this one?
Yeah, so we're hoping to kind of go through some of the history, and we may end up doing a couple of these depending on where the conversation leads and different things, but just kind of going through even just a bit of the weird, interesting history of the Five Oaks is the church we were at, but just that youth group experience that we had, and kind of just some of that history of that youth group specifically.
Yeah, so we thought this would be our a really good first episode because talking to each other and some people who hopefully will listen and were interested said, where you're at now doesn't really matter unless you know where you came from. And so we started, and this was we recorded this quite a few months ago. You'll tell from the audio quality and a lot of the saying like and whatever. I have to get over that. But the history of what our youth group and our youth group experience was like is important to know for future context for discussions and the interviews we do with our friends.
Yeah, exactly. I think especially if this podcast can kind of go out and reach other people who weren't connected to our youth group, I think some of that history will help. I mean, some of that context will help. And I'd love to see at some point eventually maybe people who didn't go to our youth group, but had a different youth group experience, they'd come on and they might have to give a little history and context too. Because I do think as I run into more and more people, like our experience was very unique, very, very unique, even in Minnesota. But if you talk to people who are from, the Bible Belt, I think their youth group experience is totally different than ours, in a lot of ways.
I think if we get to the point of talking to people who just listen and we don't know, I think that means we've made it as a podcast. Like, we got listeners. We're probably on the verge of like mega donor or mega advertisers. So we'll get there. That'll be like season 3 or 4. But at this point, I think that I remember talking through this history and we had a lot of good time reminiscing. And I think also what we try to do in this podcast or in this first episode is to reminisce a lot now so we don't necessarily have to do that a lot later.
Yeah.
Because reminiscing is fun, but if this is just a podcast about, do you remember the video we made in 10th grade? Like nobody cares.
Right.
I don't care. So we will get deeper and deeper into where people are at now as we continue to talk to them.
Yeah. And I will say, you mentioned the audio things. We are figuring this out. We're not a professional podcasting conglomerate at all, and so we're trying to figure out some of the audio things. And even if you go on, and we'd hope everybody can enjoy a number of our episodes. When we have guests, we're still trying to figure out some of that and how do we help people with some of those audio things. So I'll make the apology here. Sorry if some of the audio is not perfect. We're working on it. We're trying to get better. I am learning as I go in a lot of ways, and I've learned a lot after the first 10 or so episodes of this. I've learned a ton already, so I feel like every week when I edit something, I learn something more.
So I think and hope that people will be excited to know that we do have, I think, 12 episodes ready to go, and we will be releasing them on a semi-regular basis here over the spring and summertime. So we very much appreciate you listening. We look forward to more interactions with you, to more interactions with the people we haven't chatted with yet from Five Oaks, and hope you enjoy. Welcome back, everybody. We are here today, Caleb and I, to give some background as to our experience in the 90s, which is why you're all here to listen to our podcast. maybe there are some things that we'll talk about you can identify with, and wanted to kind of set the tone because it is not as exciting to know, how far people have come until you realize where they've come from. So we set out here today to discuss, what were we doing in youth group in the 90s, and specifically why? Where did it come from? Why did we choose to go? Why did we choose to stay? What were the things around that? So Caleb, one of the things that I had thought pertained to this conversation is kind of how things started, because as we've said in our intro, our youth group experience was somewhat unique in that for a period at the beginning, the kids outnumbered the adults in the church.
Yeah, for sure. So this is me doing a lot of this by memory, and it'll be interesting to see if other people come on and say, "Oh, it actually was like this," or this was closer to what it was. Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show. But I know we had moved out to Woodbury, Minnesota I was in 6th grade. So from 6th and 7th grade, I think we were, no, I was in 4th grade. That's right. So 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, I'm going to a Christian Missionary Alliance church. And then that church folds and basically gives the property they had bought and I think any other assets they had, they basically gift them over to the Evangelical Free Church, which is what Five Oaks was called at the time. And so we joined that church in, I want to say 92. If I was doing the math right, because 91, this is how I count my youth. 91 is the Twins World Series.
That's a good starting point.
Yeah, I'm in 7th grade. And I always use the 5-iron frenzy joke that the last great symbol of my youth, that Twins World Series is the end of my youth. They win the World Series, and now I'm a man. That's how I would describe it.
Are you sure?
But all I know is that is when I started. That's when I was in 7th grade. So I'm in 7th grade, and I think we're going to Five Oaks at that point, which is called Woodbury Evangelical Free. At the time we joined, Mark's the pastor, but shortly after we joined, maybe a year after we joined, he decides that he wants to do church planting, and so he moves on to something else. And they had just hired John, our youth pastor, for my entire experience in youth group, and I believe yours as well. Mm-hmm. They had hired him. So Mark moves on. They hire John. Mark moves on. The church is without a head pastor or a preaching pastor or whatever they called it at the time, and has a youth pastor. So that's February of 93 is when John joins the church. Yeah, so that's kind of how we got to that point. Before that, we were meeting in the high school. It was, Ryan. I don't want to name everybody's name, but it's less than 10 kids who are attending the youth group before John shows up. And I don't even think it's youth group. I think it's just Sunday morning thing. John shows up and we start doing youth group is my recollection of it, which is probably totally wrong. But yeah.
So I came along in 94, and I felt like things were already pretty well established. You mentioned our friend Ryan, who hopefully has been or will be a guest. He's my good friend from since I was 2.
Right.
Long story short, we had siblings. We were very young. We don't remember it, but they both passed away very, very young as very small babies, and they were buried right next to each other, and my parents kind of met through that tragedy, and then he lived a couple blocks away. So we stayed in touch. I had actually lived overseas for 5 years, and so some of those formative late elementary, middle school years, those were all overseas and
Hmm.
international school. I don't speak any fancy languages or anything. I wish I did, but um,
At one point you did, didn't you? Didn't you
well,
speak French?
tested out of high school French,
Oh,
but yeah,
okay. There you
that's
go.
about it. That's about it. So, but no, anyway, I had the experience of continuing to see Ryan. I would come back in the summer times. My parents would allow me to spend like 2 weeks at his house, right?
Hmm.
And we just kept this friendship going. I think one year we bought or were given the same like sporty watch thing, and we were like determined as friends to set it to the exact same time to start, so that next year when I came back, the time would be the same. And so we this didn't work. I think I lost it on the plane home or what. Um,
It didn't even make it to
it
Belgium.
didn't make it there. Anyway, he ended up being your friend because both your parents were part of, kind of came together for Woodbury Free, and then as I think as we've talked about before, the invitation came when I fully moved back in '94, and um, that was yeah, it was July '94, and then we went to Sunshine,
Yeah. Yep.
and then that was it and then I was in from there.
And that it's funny the Ryan connection, and if he ever comes on, I'll let him tell the story of our first connection because it's pretty funny, but it is distinct, and I think it's something that already made our youth group experience stand out because we joined Woodbury Free. Our parents, well, I guess I am going to tell it, cheapers. Our parents are like, these boys are basically the same age because I was right in between Derek, his older brother. Derek's, I think, 2 years ahead of me. I don't
Hmm.
know. Maybe he's only a year ahead of me, and then Ryan. And so our parents are like, "Oh, we should have the boys connect," because we started going to Woodbury E Free, and we go and we go to this Young Life thing, and I remember neither of us feeling like that was where we wanted to be. Both of us felt
Yeah.
like it wasn't. It was too cool, or we weren't cool enough, or we were too cool. One of those. I'll let you decide what you think it was, but we just didn't feel like that was it, and so we instead were started hanging out. And I think that was one of those unique things. It did feel our youth group felt different than even this very well established Young Life organization. And I don't know if people know what Young Life. Young Life's still around, right?
Still a thing. Yep.
Okay, so even that feels like something formative to me. That we it was different. It was different from the start.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up because I always felt too, having moved back and maintained one or two friendships, but not having very many, that I was instantly an outsider. I started high school in, for all intents and purposes, a brand new high school. Knew some people, but
Yeah.
especially knowing how kids grow the way they do now that we have our own, right? It was a whole, might as well have, moved to a completely new place. So I started high school knowing nobody,
Yeah.
and I felt like an outcast. And I felt like I needed a place to belong and who people who were just, willing to let me be a kid, without all that social pressure. And I don't know if it was born of that or if it's naturally this way, but I'm kind of a cynical person. That's why we're friends. But
Right. I'm
um,
I'm not just kind of cynical. I'm like known in work at work as the cynical guy. We need a negative opinion. Let's go get Caleb's.
Caleb bounced it out. But I think that fed into the whole like, hey, I'm not a part of a group. I want, and this group was very accepting,
Hmm.
right? Very willing to bring you in. Now, of course, there was, and I'm not saying this negatively per se, but there was an agenda, right? The agenda was, we want you to accept Christ, which
Yeah.
was, the main emphasis of a '90s youth group was, you must, or not you must, but we want to give you experiences so you will accept Christ, and you will feel that Christ is worth, what he did for you was worth, your devotion. Contrast that with other people's youth group experience. My wife went to Lutheran,
Hmm.
extremely liturgical Lutheran setting, and it was more about confirmation and kind of solidifying what you believe from birth that way. Which,
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. It was just different. it was there was that goal in mind, and the message, which I think is accurate still, is Jesus accept the outcasts,
Hmm.
those people who don't belong somewhere. That's the first place he's gonna. Those are the first people he's gonna connect with, and so I felt very much like, oh, this is a place where I don't have to kind of step in to a whole new social system. I can just kind of be myself because I know one, maybe two people, and then we got introduced to each other through Ryan and kind of became instant friends that way. So that whole idea of an outcast being accepted in
Yeah.
really, I think, spoke to many of us there. And John did a really good job of just being fun and open and trying to help us have a good time.
Yeah.
You know, I regard him as somebody who was, really in his heart of hearts, trying to connect with the kids on a great level. And you have a interesting story about John watching Home Improvement that I never knew about.
Well, yeah. So when you come back, 94, you made the statement that it felt like it was already established. What do you remember walking into the first? Do you remember walking? Wait, what it was like that first time you walked in 94? Because that helped me actually potentially bridge the gap for what it became. Because, like, I'll be honest, my memory is bad. I mean, I am just my kids. I don't know about you. My especially my I have a 12-year-old, and her mind is like a steel trap. She'll be like,
Hmm.
"Dad, do you remember when you said this?" No, I do not. I barely remember what I had for breakfast. Thank you. So yes.
Man, if your
So
kid was smart enough, she'd just manipulate the heck out of you.
well, she definitely could.
Could, yeah. What do I remember? I just remember that it was a lot of excitement
Hmm.
and a lot of let's have fun.
Okay.
And I think that is a memory for a lot of 90s kids is just kind of wild, crazy, zany fun, you know?
Yeah.
Whether or not that was trying to contradict or be an alternative to, the crazy fun you might have in high school or whatever. I don't know if it was entirely that. It was just like, hey, let's do crazy things to let kids be kids, you know. When I say established, it just like there was a group, there was something to do. There was kind of a point to it, which again ultimately was to be a Christian and grow in your faith, kind of stuff.
Were we meeting in people's houses, or were we in a
Yeah.
building? So we were
Yes.
still like meeting in people's houses every week.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was the same when we started, so that hadn't
Yep.
changed yet.
Yep.
You don't remember Home Improvement as a thing.
Mm-mm. I mean, I remember the show, but I don't remember it being part of youth group.
It was part of youth group for at least a bit. So we would show up at somebody's house, we'd do some sort of something, we'd watch Home Improvement, we'd break for Home Improvement, and then we would do the Bible study portion of the evening. And that was like, because I've watched a lot of Home Improvement in my life, a lot more than I ever want to, because I'm
Hmm.
not necessarily a huge fan, but it was part of the Wednesday night experience. So, and then I don't know if John wanted to watch it and then he got a VCR and he realized I can tape this and watch it later, but it was absolutely part of the experience for at least a little bit.
I wonder why that show in particular. I think there was, you look back on it and wherever Tim Allen is now, it's like wholesome, funny, family oriented, prime time popular,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like almost a little bit of foreshadowing into what Christians really wanted to be is kind of all those things without whatever worldly influence you thought was negative. But like that show, my I remember my parents and my aunt and uncle being like, you gotta watch Home Improvement, it's the best, it's so funny and it's clean, and it's just, I was like, okay. And yeah, it's kind of funny,
Yeah.
I guess.
It also had the misplaced masculinity. I mean, it really does have it all.
those
Nailed
are those are yeah, well, those are later episodes.
it.
But That's funny that it would be prioritized in the youth group setting. So I was like trying to wonder why. And maybe it was simply was he couldn't record it. I don't know. Maybe we actually will have John on and we can ask him. That kind of stuff where it was like, hey, let's laugh. There was an organization to it, intro, game, home improvement, evidently, and then Bible study, and then prayer, and then, goof around time. That's a lot for one family to bring into their house, like, 10, 12, sometimes 20 kids, those
Yeah.
large groups after a couple of years.
Yeah.
But, things like um, Chubby Bunny, where you
Yep.
stick marshmallows in your mouth and like that kind of stuff was like, hey, let's get as zany as possible.
And I feel like that's one thing that I've become in the last year. I've become kind of connected to a lot of Christians on Twitter who want to talk about music. So I post a lot on Twitter about music stuff, and I get a fair amount of reaction and interaction from people for those kind of posts. And so it's a lot of people who are like 35 to 55. It seems to be like in that range. And there's a lot of mid 40s or young 40s people that I interact with. And I have heard people talk about Pudgy Bunny or those silly games. And so what's really interesting about that is that it wasn't just our youth group. It feels like a bit of a youth group playbook.
Mm-hmm.
And what would be really interesting, I thought about trying to look it up, is like, when did the youth pastor become a job? Like, because it wasn't in the 70s for sure. I can't imagine it was a job in the 60s or in the 50s. And in the 80s and 90s, it becomes a job. You're going to college to get a youth
Youth
ministry
ministry.
degree.
Yep.
And so then you kind of get a playbook. And that is one of those distinctions about the 90s, is that I think this Christian culture that was like, in the 90s, you had 90%, in the early 90s, you had 90% of Americans saying they were Christian at some level. That's obviously dropped off. And that I don't know if I got that quote exactly right, but that's a couple of things I looked at. You have 90% of people still saying they're Christian. You go back even probably 20 years behind that, everybody is. And the 90s are that transition where I feel like you start to get Christian culture is set aside from other culture in America. That is what it happens. And I feel like the youth pastor is part of that. Like, they're there to create Christian culture for youth. It's you talked about agenda. It is that. They absolutely are doing that. And that Chubby Bunny becomes a playbook for extreme and
Right.
for
Right.
have fun. So yeah, I think that's interesting.
Well, and you see some history coming through a lot of this stuff as you get older and kind of as we get older and understand, looking back on what was influencing those things. It was, let's have fun but be different,
Hmm.
right? You got to do both those things. Okay?
Yeah.
Because the what you had the you had the apocalyptic scare stuff in the early part of the 20th century with the wars happening after that, and then you
Yeah.
had coming out of that what happened in the 60s and 70s with cultural revolution. You can say that evangelicalism was certainly a response to some of the freedom movements, personal freedom movements. We want to
Hmm.
grab some of that cultural sin and pull it back. We don't want our kids, we don't want our families partaking in that.
Mm-hmm.
There's another strain, and there's a very clear line of racism that goes into to church at that time and separating out
Mm-hmm.
people based on race. And that kind of, how is that filtering down to us? Because in the 70s that was working itself out, and then in the 80s it really solidified with a lot of things like the moral majority, and the Christian right, and all these people, particularly white males, establishing themselves as the authority of morality, and then
Hmm.
trying to push that as far down and as young as possible.
Hmm.
And you get to us early 90s, right? We're not talking
Yeah.
98, we're talking early 90s. It's already been worked on and established in ideas in churches is, hey, we got to, in an evangelical church, we're setting up a different group for kids not to learn their catechism or go to communion
Mm.
and confess a faith that way. It's we're pulling them out to be super different and set apart so
Yeah.
that when they go back to school, they are set apart. They are different. They're in the world, but not of the world, whatever, phrase you'd like to use. And all of a sudden it's like you're getting messages like the world is against you
Hmm.
and you can't be of it. And it's the world is this terribly evil place. And we want to give you a spot where you don't have to be living in there. And sometimes that resonated, right? Because you're in high school and high school's
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you want to escape it.
Yeah.
So I think some of those historical influences as they flow down into the 80s, particularly what it meant for culture in the 60s, for freedom and politics in the 80s, really, helped me understand that, hey, in the 90s, I was living in a world where adults were reacting to what they perceived as people sinning too much. And they wanted to embed in kids very early on that you shouldn't do that.
Yeah. And like, you think about some of those things like I never participated. We never did. Kudos to our church. We never had like a book burning or
No, like
a
a
CD
CD.
burning.
No,
I love how I
no,
gave
no.
kudos to us.
Well, frankly, more churches than we understand did that.
But like that is something that I think even we would have been like, "Oh, that's a little much, don't you think?" But like I do think that was a thing for people that that whole idea of set apart and different really I don't think it's something I really understood until much later and kind of the we talk about like the idea of tentacles, like how much that like those tentacles have touched people,
Hmm.
throughout the time after they left church in
Hmm.
some way.
So yeah, as we were talking about, there are so many political and outside influences, and forcing us to be set apart was a really big deal. And I'll always kind of remember that phrase.
Hmm.
It made kids feel special.
Yeah. Oh
It
yeah.
made kids feel like, oh, I have a calling. And look, kids need that. I'm not saying they don't.
Hmm.
Um, but it also didn't teach you how to interact with the real world,
Hmm.
and to be part of it and to be part of other people's lives when you are essentially being taught that they're at the very least sinful and ultimately just kind of your enemy because they're partaking in the world. So
Hmm.
why were we being so forced to be set apart? Again, I think to my wife's experience of being in a confirmation class, I remember very distinctly being kind of crapping on. We haven't done our swearing episode yet, but not kind of crapping on other forms of Christianity, like Lutherans, Catholics. They don't got it. They don't have a relationship with Jesus. We do. We
Yeah.
got it right. And I remember distinctly because I did grow up, going to Woodbury Lutheran, and then when we lived
Hmm.
overseas, we were trying to do it, but it was more difficult during the late '80s to find a church that was, similar to that because all the churches over there were super old and
Hmm.
traditional, and so, it was this like reaction to, okay, Christianity's been here. It's been in the it's been here during the Great Awakening, which was its own, revolution to itself. It's been here during, the sexual revolution, and it's done nothing for culture.
Hmm.
And we've got it right now because we have the right message about Jesus, which is you have to cross the line of faith, and the other places do not. And so I remember clearly questioning whether people who were Lutheran or Catholic
Yeah.
were at that point in my belief system going to heaven or hell.
Right.
because it was very distinct. Like we have this message and we have to get it out to everybody,
Right.
because if you don't have that message, you're going to hell. And even if you're a Catholic, right? Even if you're whatever, Presbyterian, didn't matter, because all those were just kind of the old way of doing things. This is the new way. We've got it.
Right.
Which, if you had a nickel for every time a group of Christians throughout history thought that, you'd be rich. So, I mean, not it's embarrassing to think that we bought into it. But again, we're 13, 14 years old. Plus, they're feeding us marshmallows all the time. They're giving us the excellent experience. Look, I went to my first concert with you and John and Ryan and maybe Derek at Concordia, small venue. We saw Steve Taylor there, who's still a prolific piece of, part of Christian music.
Hold on. We saw Steve Taylor and Guardian. Let's not forget
Oh,
Guardian.
yeah. Sorry,
Step
we
off.
lost a listener there.
Step off.
When I didn't mention Guardian. Um, yeah, and that was my first concert, and I had never gone to a show before,
Hmm.
and it was great because you
Yeah.
just got to dance around. It was fun. The music was good. Um, and that's what they were pitching, right? Is you can do these things that are similar to the world, but not the same.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of you're special. You're that way.
You're special. What's even crazy to think about is 13, 14, 15, 16 debating the idea of, are Lutherans really Christian? Like,
Hmm.
even that entire conversation feels so outrageous to even have been thinking those things. As now, again, like, older, wiser, whatever, but like, it wasn't like that was like frowned upon. Like, oh, guys,
Let's tone it
oh,
down.
yeah, that's a little much, don't you think? Because I totally have had that. I will say in college I had the reverse experience too. Of I had a Lutheran really mad at me because I wasn't going to baptize my children that I didn't have. But like he was like yelling at me, and I was like, "Whoa,
Hmm.
I'm sorry. I just
Hmm.
don't." So it's funny that but yeah, I totally remember having those thoughts and feelings, and I bet you we did at some point have those conversations in a youth group setting. I wouldn't be shocked if we had them.
Do you remember anything specific that was taught or implied that was also like a divisive, like almost lovingly divisive? Like, we don't hate them, but dot dot dot. Like, I mean, I think that was part of the evangelical culture to set you apart. Is you had kind of make sure you let the kids know that why that group or that said that person was not a Christian yet, not on the inside circle. Like, do you remember anything that was divisive that way?
So the two things that come to mind. Well, there's a couple things that come to mind, but I'm going to save the one for other conversations because it's it's one that stands out to me, even though it's not useful. One for sure is I do remember the hate the sin, love the sinner being a mantra of 90s and probably 2000s and probably 80s. It probably is way bigger than the 90s. So I remember that being a thing, right? And that's
Hmm.
a whole other conversation probably. But I think that takes those steps towards it. I think the 90s are so the 80s, I always refer to like the 70s and 80s Christian culture is like satanic panic. Like,
Hmm.
you play AC/DC backwards and it's telling you to drink the blood of the innocent or whatever. I mean, I think the song Straightforward is telling you that. So you don't need to play it backwards. But I think there's that, and then there's that morphs into conversations about cults, and then I think that morphs into the idea that like things like Mormonism, this is a whole can of worms, holy cow. But the idea of
I'm
Mormonism,
I'm hanging in there. Keep going.
Mormonism being this like this cult, and I bet you then it did lead to that conversation where because that's where it starts, right? Like that actually is an okay one in my opinion to let's make some decisions about whether this is genuine faith. But you can see how slippery that slope gets to, well, let's talk about Catholics and Lutherans and I don't know, whatever, all the other ones.
Anglicans,
Yeah,
right?
Anglicans and
Methodists.
Methodists. There you go. All I can think of was Mennonite. I was like,
There's that too.
that's not right.
So what you're saying is there was kind of this implication like because we have things correct, we also have at least some insight and maybe a bit of authority to say, well, that person isn't a Christian yet.
Yep. And I think the other big teaching that I don't know when this started, but it definitely was there in the 90s was the idea of you can go to church and not be a Christian. Like that probably is a distinction that distinction I bet you was not made in the 60s when pretty much everybody went to church. You didn't have people saying, and outside of like the town drunk, right? Like you probably didn't have like somebody saying up and be like, well, you're here at church, but you're not really a Christian. Like, so when did that evaluation of other people's faith start? Because that's something that was definitely there. You talked about that idea of like, well, just showing up doesn't count. It's got to be real. You've got to, you use the phrase cross the line of faith. You've got to have Jesus in your heart. And that feels like something that did not exist at some point. You weren't making this evaluation of somebody else's faith
Mm-hmm.
that they were or were not a Christian. So yes, maybe not explicitly called out. I don't remember anything, but there was a lot of these subtle things that came in that I feel like helped you define who was a real Christian and who wasn't.
Well said.
I mean, is there anything for you?
I talked about the church thing, the judging other Christians of faith,
Sure.
and I think that probably came along of like, hey guys, kids, that wasn't doing it for you. That youth group
Hmm.
over there at the Lutheran Church, that's boring, right? Now here's an experience I had. I did go to that when I came back. I did try a little bit to go to the Lutheran youth group, which actually was rather large. There were a lot of
Hmm.
kids from high school who were going there, and it was like huge. And I saw these kids there who said
Hmm. Yeah.
said they were Christians, but at high school they were acting like whatever. Even
Yep.
even if they weren't acting like jerks or acting outlandishly, they weren't passing up to what I thought the standards were. And so I was like,
Hmm.
this place is full of fakes.
Yeah.
I don't want to go here. And then I remember a couple years later, one of the pastors at that church, we were still kind of like connected. My parents were still kind of connected with that church a little bit, and
Yeah.
they were friends, with one of the pastors or whatever. And I think the pastor's daughter was like a couple years younger than me, or maybe um, a year young. I can't remember.
Hmm.
And I was like, you should come to our youth group because ours is the best. And she was like, no, I'm actually like mine. And it was like a numbers game,
Sure.
right? Like
Oh
if
yeah.
you can, like I'm going out to convert the Lutherans. Like what am I doing? I look back and it's like that's where we're spending some of our energy.
Right.
Um, and it just obviously feels weird to both you and me now to do that, but it was certainly. Look, I'm in sales now. It's not different than any other sales pitch, to be quite honest with you. You're selling something to people. And I think the whole point of this podcast is, has it stuck? And was the sales pitch legit or not?
Well, and how has the sales pitch evolved? Because that sales pitch is still there. Oh man, I got fun stories about that with my
Right,
kids. Holy
right.
cow!
So, well, I wanted to ask you as maybe a final question here. What is a crazy story, game, situation you remember from your youth group experience? Like the craziest thing you can remember doing.
Yeah, so I think we'll be able to come up with multiple of these like throughout the series if this thing takes off. But I'll throw out one. The one that I remember is it was one of the silly games, and it was strings and spoons, and we had a ton of string tied to spoons, and you were lined up in like two lines, and you were threading string and spoons through your clothes. And I think we were going. This gets so weird. And man, somebody else is going to come on the show and be like, Caleb really messed up that story. It wasn't like
I
this at
don't
all.
remember this either.
I remember we were outside, we were in front of somebody's yard, and so you'd string the spoon down your shirt and then like up somebody else's pants and then down the next person's shirt. So it ties you together. And obviously, like the string is like pulling through and it's getting awkward. I think it was, yeah, and kind of inappropriate potentially. Like you're pulling somebody's shirt and all of a sudden, like their loose shirt is getting smaller because it's being pulled down, which is a little, it feels vaguely sexual in some ways. I mean, it's this weird thing. And then it was, you thread it through and then I think you threaded it back and the team that threaded it the fastest won. And then I do remember unthreading it didn't work. Like we were trying to get it out and somebody, it might have been me, somebody like ran for it. And that then pulled all of the thread, and so then people were like in pain. That made the tangled shirts worse. And then I do remember. Do you remember my room in high school? And like we would just have like crap tacked up to the wall. That string and spoons made it onto my wall, so it was hung from my wall and ceiling. So that is one that I remember, and I don't know why that game stands out to me more than. I remember doing Pudgy Bunny and doing those things, but that's the one that stands out so clearly to me. Ugh. And I swear it was later in high school, so it's funny that you don't remember it. And somebody's going to be like...
We've established my memory's terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah, yikes. Probably some injuries there that there's a liability form to sign for
just
now.
The awkwardness of it. Like, you're standing next to some girl from your high school... and she's shoving a spoon down her shirt, and then you're taking it and shoving it up your pants. Like, it's just a weird game.
Very weird. Very weird. All right, so mine is, do you remember the kidnapping?
Oh my gosh. I didn't until you said it.
So the kidnapping was, we had, as we mentioned before, we did have a sizable amount of high school kids in this youth group, right? But it started as a smaller group.
Yes.
5th, 6th, 7th graders, 7th, 8th graders. And then majority was high school. Well, at the beginning of the year, what happens to those 8th graders, right? They're graduating to high school. I don't know whose idea it was. I just know I did it like every single year I could because it was pretty fun. But what we would do, the parents were in on it. Our youth leaders would tell the parents, right? We'd pick a Saturday night, like in August or September or something. And the high school kids, right?
Yep.
Certainly everybody on the leadership team, like you and me, had to do this. Would get in the car with the youth leaders. So there was like 4 youth leaders, our youth pastor included, driving their cars around in a caravan around town. And you'd show up to the family's house. You'd barge in the door. You'd run through the house. You'd find the 8th grader, and you would literally tie them up, kidnap them for the night, put them in the car, and peel off to go get the next one.
Oh my! I do remember this,
and I remember very distinctly. It might have been like junior year. It wasn't the first year I did it. Might have been like junior. We got pulled over by the cops. We got pulled over. There's 4 cars, all vans, John's old station wagon, and there are kids tied up in their cars, and all of us like look crazy. Like a part of it too was us. High schoolers would dress up all crazy, like we just, you could dress like a burglar, you could dress all crazy in crazy clothes. So you got crazy high school kids, you got adults who are flustered, and you got these 8th graders who some of them are legitimately crying because they don't want to do this. And the cops were like, what is going on?
Oh,
and John was able to talk them out of it, and on we went, and we spent, we would spend the night at the wherever the church was at, or I can't remember, maybe somebody's house maybe. And they, of course, go home the next day. But kidnapping was a big deal because we were like, this
Oh.
is great. And now you're like, those basically hazing,
Yeah.
basically.
No, not basically. It was. Oh,
So,
man. So,
yeah.
oh, man, that's crazy. And that's a distinction, too, because when I started, going back to 92 to wrap it all in, it was everybody. It was 7th, 8th, ninth, 10th. It was, we were all together because I remember there were older kids and then they had to hang out with us junior high kids because there wasn't the youth group was everybody and
Mm-hmm.
it didn't have that split.
Mm-hmm.
And it had to have had that split before I graduated because I don't think I was really in youth group with my sister ever. I think we
Yeah.
always missed each
7th and
other.
8th was, separate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Oh, now that you say it, holy crap. Oh man, that's terrifying.
Yeah. Well, there's obviously everybody grows and progresses in some way, and they probably don't do that anymore. But we'll have to
Well,
find out if they do.
do
And
that's what I want. That's what I want to know. If was that in the youth
playbook.
group handbook? Yeah, the youth pastor handbook, was that in there? Kidnap the incoming eighth graders and scare them.
Yeah.
Man alive.
So, well, this has been very fun to reminisce. There will be more about this, but again, we are hoping that at least you kind of understand where we're coming from, and we can kind of settle on some themes, some topics that show you where we were as opposed to where we are now. The only way to do that is kind of highlight these early parts of the journey. So, we would love it if you commented on Twitter about your craziest youth group experience. We'd love to hear from you and just, go nuts. Our Twitter handle is at ISurvivedYG.
Hold on, I gotta look it up. I tried to tweet with it today and it wouldn't work.
I said
Let's
that
see.
confidently, so you could maybe cut it off right there at the end.
Nah, I'll just be unconfident. That's the way I roll. Survived YG is the handle.
Survived.
Yep, survived YG.
So our handle is at SurvivedYG on Twitter or X. I'm not going to call it X. Sorry. Go there and tell us, what was your craziest experience, because I want to see you as the best one.
Yep. You can also email us, ISurvivedYouthGroup at gmail.com. That's the email account I pilfered.
Yeah, if you email us, maybe we'll read some next time.
Yeah, we can fill those in.
All right. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. We'll be back.
Sounds good. Thanks for listening to this episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. We hope you enjoyed it. The music at the beginning and the end of the show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Let us know what you thought of this show or any of our other shows. If you want to follow the show on Twitter, our handle is at SurvivedYG. You can also email us at ISurvivedYouthGroup at gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, drop us a line. We would love to have you. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, leave a rating or a review. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a weekly music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. On the podcast, I then go and recap the week and talk about some of my favorites or other historically important albums that were posted about throughout the week. Once again, it's the Album Anniversary Podcast. Thanks again, and we will talk to you soon.